Luke chapter 13 from 10 to 17. On a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and she couldn't straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, she called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant, because Jesus had healed her on Sabbath, the synagogue ruler said to people, "There are 6 days for the work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." The Lord answered them, "You hypocrites, doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give water? Then not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 years, be set free on Sabbath day from what bound her?" When he said this, all opponents were humiliated, but people were delighted with all his wonderful things he was doing.
Amen. Thank you. Great. Who is the most famous celebrity you have spotted in your local area? I want you to turn to the person next to you. I want you to tell them. Who do you reckon is the most famous person? If you've got no one sat next to you, just turn behind you, because there's often someone sat behind you. Who have we got? Who have we got in the room? Give me some shout outs. Who have you spotted on the high street? Who's been around? Mighty Boosh. Great. Keir Starmer. Yeah. Oh, Matt Conroy, louder. Ricky Gervais, yeah, lives next door to, I shouldn't tell you where he lives, actually. Beyonce. Where was that? In LA. Anyone else? Anyone can beat Beyonce? That is pretty good. Michael Jackson? Where was that? Where was that? Where did you meet him? It's all right. My early newborn mum days, it's fine. So, David Beckham, where did you spot him? In a pub in Hackney. There you go. I recently got sent this video from someone I played netball with. This was, she was just in the corner shop in Parkway, and this is what happened. Sing it.
I have run, I have walked, I have sailed these walls.
Unbelievable, right? Unbelievable porno. Just in a corner shop in Parkway. No, less than a mile from here. So good. We live in this sort of area, don't we? Where it's just normal. It's normal. Like, this kind of thing is kind of normal, right? We see people who are famous. Jesus is like, yeah, maybe it's not normal. But I feel like in Camden, you almost walk around expecting to see someone famous. There's a kind of buzz, isn't there? Feels like a place of significance. And I know for me, I get kind of caught up in that. You know, when I got sent that clip, I was like, I am messaging this to all of my family who do not live in London. You know, we kind of have this thing, we get caught up in the boasting about it. We boast about the impressive people who are around us, who we have seen or spent time with. Today, I want to ask the question about whether that would be Jesus's way. Is that Jesus's way? If Jesus were here today, where would you find him? Where would you find him? Jesus were here today, who would you find him with? We're going to do that by looking through this passage that we just had read to us on Luke 13, 10 to 21. And as I was thinking about this topic, so we're in this series called Allegiance. We've kind of been in and out of it, thinking about the places and spaces of the kingdom of God. Where is God at work? Where did Jesus, the kind of places he wanted to be, the sort of people he wanted to be with? So I thought about that. There were so many passages I could have chosen to basically make the same point, but we're landing in Luke 13 today. And verse 10 says this: on a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues. One of the synagogues. The question is though, where? Where is this synagogue? You see, this part of Luke's gospel, but basically Luke's gospel is geographically structured. The first half all happens in the north of the country. Then the middle chapters happen on the journey from the north to on the way to Jerusalem. And he ends in Jerusalem. And this chapter falls in this journey where he started this journey towards Jerusalem. And the sense is, though, because in chapter 17, he's told to be between Samaria and Galilee. We probably think that this happens in the region of Galilee, right at the top. This was the northern province of Israel. Israel itself was a small backwater part of the Roman Empire. The most southern-eastern corner of the empire at this point in history. Over 2,000 kilometers away from the center of power in Rome. In the Rest is History podcast, where they do a section, they do a two-parter. If you've not listened to it, it is brilliant, on the life of Jesus. They describe this area in Galilee as like the northern hinterlands. They actually compare it to Yorkshire, which I think is slightly unfair. But anyway, they do that in this podcast. And it's this place that defines itself as not the South. If any of you have spent any time in the north of our country, there is a very strong thing in that we are not the South. We are from the north. Okay, and so that was what was going on in this part of the world as well. They were looked down upon, this northern region, by the elites living in Jerusalem. But this is where Jesus spent most of his life. An insignificant an unimpressive place, far from the center of power. And if you think about the places that we associate with Jesus, where was Jesus born, for example? Thank you. Bethlehem, great. Bethlehem, a little village 5 miles outside of the capital. An agricultural village that probably was main benefit was it was raising the word escaped, the kind of sheep and goats, the cattle that would have been killed in the temple. And even in this village that had one famous person, David, this village, where did Jesus find himself in this village? Not in the most impressive house, but in a cattle shed, or at least in a place where animals normally would have been. And then we hear that as Matthew, that he starts in Bethlehem and he goes off to Egypt as a refugee. He's living in a foreign land, far from his home country. And then we're told he moves to Nazareth. Nazareth was a tiny little village. Archaeologists who've dug around that place think there was probably only a handful of families who lived there. There was no through road. It was really the backwaters. That is the reason why when someone tells that Jesus is from Nazareth, Philip is like, what? Can anything good come from there? Because it was just so small. It was a nothing place. And then he spends most of his ministry in Galilee, which is where we find him in this passage. And when he does make it to the center of power, into Jerusalem, what happens to him? He's killed outside the city walls. Jesus spends most of his time in unimpressive and insignificant places. But when he does so, he puts them on the map. But he doesn't just do that with places. Even when he is in a place of relative power, He is seeking out the people on the edge. He is seeking out the seemingly insignificant and the powerless people in that place. So we read, don't we, in verse 10, that he is in a synagogue in this kind of backwater part of the Roman Empire. But he's in a synagogue. And a synagogue was a center of community life. It was a gathering point. It was like a community center. There were places where people would gather, yes, to discuss religious things, but they'd also be like chatting about what was happening in the local community. They'd be chatting about politics. It acted a bit like a town hall. And in this time that Jesus is in this synagogue, it's the third time we hear about Jesus doing something specific in a synagogue. The first time in Luke, he's in Nazareth, the place that he was from, this little backwater village. And he gives what becomes what we think of as basically his manifesto. He stands there and he says this: "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoner and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then he is so bold. He rolls up the scroll. He puts it down on the side and he says, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." He sets out his manifesto in the first synagogue. In the second synagogue, we find him in Luke. He is in Capernaum, and he is met by a man who is possessed with a demon, and he sets him free, doing exactly the thing he said he would do in that first synagogue. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, to set the oppressed free. And now here he is in yet another synagogue, and he meets a woman. Verse 11 tells us there was a woman who'd been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and she could not straighten up at all. 18 years of not being able to look at the sky, not being able to raise her eyes as they were told to in the Psalms to the mountains or to Jerusalem. 18 years of not being able to look people in the eye. And presumably 18 years of quite a lot of pain and quite a lot of discomfort. But remember also, she's living in a culture where disability was seen as a curse. This woman would have been thought of as someone who God had cursed. And where her value in that society, value was often attributed, as it often is today, by how much someone can do, by what they can produce. She could do nothing. She was bent over. And she's a woman in a man's world. A woman in this day and age were often treated as second-class citizens, treated as the property of either their husband or a father. And so whilst in the synagogue at this point in the history, there weren't segregated men and women's areas, you can imagine this woman is right at the back. She's not at the front. She's hiding in the shadows. And it's clear when Jesus goes on to heal her, that the synagogue leader is pretty annoyed by this. She's seen as a distraction to him. But do you see what Jesus does? Verse 12, he saw her. He saw her. Jesus, the rabbi, notices this woman, this crippled woman, bent over, looking at the ground. She was seen. When she could not look at him in the face, he saw hers. One of my favorite names for God in the Old Testament is El Roi. And it comes from a story about a woman called Haggai. Haggai was a servant woman, and she was kind of linked in with Abraham and Sarai. And this point where she's pregnant and she's been kicked out of Abraham's household and she's left pregnant in the desert, all alone. A woman in a man's world, another mistreated woman. And she has this beautiful encounter with the Lord. And she says this: "You are the God who sees me. I have been seen by the one who sees me. It's more than just a glance. It's more than just being looked at. She is seen for who she is. All of the pain, all of the anguish, all of the hopes and dreams, she is seen for who she is. There are so many people out there in our world who are overlooked, who are not seen by those in power, who feel unseen. And maybe that is you here today. But the God we worship, the God we have just sung about, is El Roy, the God who sees you. Second thing that Jesus does is he calls her forward. He calls her to himself. So if you imagine that kind of space being laid out, he's in the middle of the synagogue and she's hiding in the background. He calls her forward, out of the shadows, into the center. Throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus doing this time and time and time again, welcoming those who are on the edge. I mean, just look at his disciples, the uneducated fisherman, a hated tax collector, a member of a terrorist organization. That's what the Zealots were. He has women in his inner circle, including one who'd been possessed by demons. He welcomes children to himself. He touches lepers. He eats with prostitutes and sinners. And he allows, as we thought about 2 weeks ago, a promiscuous woman to wash his feet with his tears. Jesus calls those who are on the very edge of society, the most marginalized, into the center. I mean, notice who he said in his manifesto, who he came for: the poor, the prisoners, the blind, the oppressed. Jesus creates community where the most marginalized are at the center, just like emperor penguins. It's a great picture. I love emperor penguins. If you've spent any time with me, and may have heard me talk about emperor penguins before, emperor penguins are beautiful, and I think they're a beautiful picture of the kind of community that Jesus creates. Because when the cold Antarctic wind blows, they put their strongest on the outside. And right in the center, they put their babies to keep them safe, to keep them warm. Penguins place the most vulnerable at the center and form community around them. And I think this is a beautiful picture of what Jesus does when he creates community. I guess the question is that what we do? So he sees her. He calls her forward. And then we read that he speaks to her and says, "Woman, you are free from your infirmity." He's doing exactly what he said he would do. Just like the second time he was in a synagogue, here he is again proclaiming freedom for the prisoners, setting the oppressed free. And then he touches her in verse 13. And she's free. She straightens up. 18 years of being bent down, and suddenly she can lift her head up. She can look to the sky. She can stand tall. She can look in the eye the person who saw her. A couple of commentators that I read as I was reading over this passage suggest that actually even the touch is unnecessary. He's already spoken the word and she is healed. And so this touch is one of compassion. You see, when Jesus heals, he doesn't do it to show off his power. He does it to reveal his love primarily. So he goes the extra mile and he touches her. He says, "You're part of this community." And then in verse 15, he calls her a daughter of Abraham. There are two individual women in the entirety of Luke's gospel who Jesus calls daughter. The first is the woman who is bleeding and reaches out to touch him. This woman who would have been excluded because of her bleeding for the last 12 years, would have been excluded from the religious and the social center of their people. And yet when he heals her, he says to her, "Take heart, daughter." And in doing so, this woman who has been rejected by society is suddenly adopted, welcomed into the kingdom of God, given status and dignity. And here is the second woman, who he calls a daughter of Abraham. "You hypocrites," Jesus said, "doesn't each of you on a Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out and give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, who Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath from what has bound her?" When Jesus says this, he is directing it at the synagogue leader, the person who was supposed to be in charge, the most powerful in that place. And he's saying, "You're being a hypocrite. How dare you treat your animals better than this woman? How dare you allow them to be cared for on the Sabbath, but not this woman in front of you? Do you not know who she is? She is a daughter of Abraham. And therefore, she is an inheritor of all of the promises of God's people. She is part of my chosen group. How dare you treat her like that?" Jesus gives this woman deep dignity. He restores her status. Because this is what Jesus came to do. Not to impress the impressive, but to restore those on the edge. To see those who are who are seemingly the most insignificant and place them at the center. He went to the unimpressive places, the insignificant places, and he puts them on the map. And even when he is in those centers of relative power, he sees, calls, and restores those who are on the very edge of that space, the seemingly insignificant, and he gives them a place at the table. So what then does that mean for us? 3 questions. The first is this: are you willing to go to the insignificant, the unimpressive places? You know, we sit here, don't we, in Kentish Town, very close to the centre of London, a global city, a place of deep power, a place with a lot of impressive stuff happening. My question is, if Jesus called you to give this up, this being able to walk out your high street and Bono just is in the local corner shop, Jesus called you to go somewhere way more insignificant, would you go? Now, clearly, Jesus uses those in positions of power, and he uses those in places of power. But following Jesus doesn't necessarily mean that you will always be called to the places of significance or the impressive places. In fact, I would suggest he often calls us to the insignificant places, the unimpressive places. Are you open? Are you willing to go? Secondly, are you willing to see and be seen with the insignificant people? When you walk into a room, who do you go and talk to first? Who do you see first? Who do you seek to draw in to the conversation? When you're at a party, when you're at work, when you're at church or a family gathering, who is it that you're talking to? Who is it that you are seen with? The seemingly impressive people, the ones with power? I think Jesus would challenge us to go to the edge. In every space and every place that you go to, there are people on the edge. There are people with less power. I think Jesus calls us to them, to draw them in. My best friend at secondary school is incredible at this. Partly, I think, because she grew up in a vicarage, and so she always just had loads of different people come into her house. She lived in one of the rougher parts of Nottingham. Her house was always full of all sorts of different people. She's incredible that when she walks into a space, she always sees the person on the edge. You will always find her talking to them. And that comes, though, because she knows that she is loved. She knows that she is secure. I think sometimes for us, isn't it? We don't do that because when we walk into a room, we don't know if we have a place there. We also we use the other powerful people in the room to make us feel like we are more significant. So we go and talk to them. I guess my encouragement would be that look to God for your significance. Look to God for those words of affirmation. So then you can go fully knowing who you are into every space that you enter. And not need to get that affirmation from the powerful people in the room, but you can go to those on the edge. I think it's really interesting in John's gospel when Jesus goes and washes the disciples' feet. This is what John says literally just before he does it. He says, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up and washed the disciples' feet. It's because Jesus knows who he is in the Father. It is because Jesus knows where his significance comes from and where he is going that he is able to do the most lowly job. And so if you're like, I'd love to be more that person, my encouragement would be seek the Father's love. Hear his affirmation. And then when you walk into the room, you don't need to get it from anyone else. You can go to those on the edge. Are you willing to see and be seen with the insignificant people? And finally, I'm really mindful we've got an election coming up, haven't we? I'm not going to tell you how to vote because that is not my place. But I have this question. Are you willing to use your vote for the insignificant people and places? Are you willing to read through the manifestos of each party and think, who of these have got the most vulnerable at the center? Who of these are going to make sure that the forgotten people in our nation are going to be seen? And are you willing to vote for them, even if actually they might not be the best party for your own interests? Are you willing to use your vote for the insignificant places and people in our country? You see, Jesus calls us to follow him, to be those who seek those on the edge, to draw them to the center. Are you willing to take up that call? Shall we stand?